Hi everyone, I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this training video because what we're doing right now is we want to bring something to the forefront of life group culture, which is spiritual conversation, which may be a new concept or new vocabulary. And so we want to take just the next few minutes and kind of talk about what this means and how to incorporate it, not just with you, but with your life groups as a whole. So first of all, we think that growing spiritually, it's not just about learning the Bible, which tends to be our go-to, but true growth really comes from spiritual conversation. Now, spiritual conversation, it's about talking about what is going on in your life and how it intersects with what God is doing. Spiritual conversation, it's about how life and faith are connected. And this, when we do this, this allows us to support each other, to help each other, maybe at times hold each other accountable. And so what we want to do is kind of talk through a couple steps on how to begin to engage spiritual conversation in our life groups. And we think that the best way to do this is going to be starting with spiritual conversation begins with telling your story. And you're telling your story. It's about letting people know you, get an idea of who you are and where you came from. And when we tell our story, it lets people have a glimpse into our lives and where they can actually begin to know us. And so what we want is we want everyone in the group to have the opportunity to share their story. And I'm not just talking like the quick 1-minute version of your story of what state were you born in and where did you go to school and your relationships, but what does the 20 to 30-minute version of your story look like? I know, again, some of us were thinking, wow, that's a long time. For others, we're like, no, we could talk for hours about our whole story. But I'm saying, how do we begin with a version of our story that goes beyond just the surface and lets others begin to see us for who we really are? And what that means is, how do we start to share the significant or defining moments in our life? And it may be where you grew up or your education or relationships. Maybe it's about challenges that you had when you were growing up. It's also the thought of, what did your spiritual journey look like? And we want to encourage people to jump into this and have fun with it. It may mean, even as you tell your story, maybe you're digging out some photo albums that you can share with some people, or pulling up some pictures on your phone, or whatever it would be. But the whole point is we want people to begin to share who they are so that other people can get to know them. What we are encouraging is, when we do this, that leaders, the life group leaders, we want you to go first, because it will give people an example on what to do and make it easier for people to follow up after you. And then once the leader goes first, we're thinking, what if one or two people, every time that your group met, they would share their story? Again, this might take up most of the time in your life group, but that's okay. And it's also knowing full well that it might take you weeks or even months for everyone to have the opportunity to share their story, and that's okay. There's no timetable here. There's no reason to hurry through this, because the most important thing is we're laying the groundwork that we can start to have spiritual conversation. And that groundwork is going to happen when we start to get to know each other's story. Now, some of you might be asking, you know what, our group has been together for a while, and we already know each other, and do we really need to tell our stories again? We feel like everyone already knows us. And all I want to say is, there's a good chance that not everyone in your group knows your story. And if you think they do, then maybe there's a deeper layer of your story that you can begin to share with them. Another question people may have is, do I need to tell everything in my story? I mean, let's be honest, some of us, we've got parts of our story that are hard to talk about. They might even bring up emotions of pain and regret or shame. There's parts of our story that that's just too personal. And what we encourage people, sure, we want you to tell your story, but don't share anything that you have to compromise your own integrity and to make you feel uncomfortable. we want people to be able to just feel free to share the parts that they feel comfortable with. Now, for us to be able to do this and start to engage in spiritual conversation, it all means we've got to have some ground rules, and I'm going to cover some of the obvious here. Things like, if we're going to share parts of our life that are personal, confidentiality, it's a given, which means, of course, we want to make sure the people in our group know that what's talked about in a group it's not public information, unless we've got permission from that person. The other key point here is we need to encourage our people in our group, as we hear each other's stories, we got to be very clear to accept each other. There are going to be people from different backgrounds and different belief systems, different approaches to life. And how about we just accept each other for being human here, not being critical, not being judgy when it comes to other people and their stories or what they're going through, but how do we truly accept each other? And then here's another big one, and that is, as you hear things that you might hear someone talk about their problems, it is not our job to fix each other. Some of us are fixers and problem solvers, and we want to jump into, hey, do you know what you should do to make that better in your life? Or I know a better way for you to do that. Our job is not to fix people, but I want us to have empathy and understanding for other people's stories so that we can stand together instead of just trying to fix each other. So it's all starting with, how do we start to tell our big stories so that everyone in your group, they have an understanding of who each other are. And we're convinced that when we do this, we're starting to have relationships, and it's enabling us to have conversations on a deeper level that maybe we've never had before. And so once this happens, then we're going to move on to, how do we have ongoing spiritual conversation in our groups? Well, here's kind of the next step to that. And that is, how do we engage the group and talk about what's our I'm going to call it our weekly story. In other words, what happened this week? What was the best part of your week? Or what was the hardest or the worst part of your week? So imagine with me, when your group gets together, everyone has the opportunity to share just a couple minutes on what was the highlight of my week, or what was the challenge of my week. Because what happens when we do this is we start to see, as we talk about our week, how do we see that, was God engaged in some part of our week? Do we see Him moving in some aspect of our week? Whether it was through good times or even the challenges. But we're starting to engage in conversation that goes below the surface a bit. And we're starting to deal with the realities of life and talk it through together. And then one more thing that we're starting to do and encourage life groups to do is, we are putting together new sermon notes and discussion guides that connect with what is being preached on a Sunday morning. And so every Sunday we have sermon notes already, but we're doing like a 2.0 version, where we're going to start to include group discussion questions that lead towards greater spiritual conversation. Because we want people to take a deeper dive into the Sunday sermon and ultimately engage in spiritual conversation around this weekly topic. And so this alone might steer your group away from following some other curriculums and starting to focus more on, how do we take what's being taught on a Sunday morning and to have greater spiritual conversation around that. And so all I'm saying is, we're kind of introducing something new on how do we together as a church engage in what is going to lead us towards spiritual growth the most. And we're convinced it's around having spiritual conversation. So whether that's beginning to tell your big story, whether that is kind of the weekly updates of the good things and the challenges going on in your life and how you see God working through all of it. Or maybe that conversation is being moved along by looking at even what we're teaching on a Sunday morning and following the discussion guide questions for your group. The point is, we're encouraging every group to take a step to have greater levels of spiritual conversation. But we also know that this is new, and so if you need help, that's why we're here. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions or you want to know how to translate this into your group or some struggles, but call me, text me, email me, whatever it is, and we're going to walk you through. But we believe together, as we engage in spiritual conversation, we think that we're going to not just grow as individuals, but we're going to grow together as groups, and ultimately our church is going to grow as we become greater disciples of Christ. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this, and we pray God's blessing upon you.